Good morning, you beautiful people. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Kusha Navidar. I'm filling in for Brian today. Coming up on today's show, WNYC and Gothamist reporter Karen Yee will share her reporting on the Mamdani administration's plans for city-run grocery stores, including what kind of discount you might expect on staples like meat and fresh produce. Plus, the writer Lucy Schiller explores aging and elder care inspired by her time caring for her grandmother during the pandemic. That story resonates with me, and I'm guessing with a lot of us, since we'll all either be caregivers or will be cared for, or both. And we'll wrap up today with some advice on how to be a good roommate. I don't think we've ever talked about this on the show, which is funny considering how many people in this expensive place need to share space with other people to afford the rent. And even if you don't have roommates, I'm guessing a lot of the advice we'll hear also applies to how to be just, a considerate human being. So stay tuned for that. But first, as we near the end of primary season and start looking towards the November midterms, Democrats are zeroing in on their efforts to take back the Senate. They need to flip 4 seats to take and regain control of the chamber. And you've probably heard about some of the higher profile battleground races. In Maine, the progressive challenger and political outsider Graham Plattner stepped down this month amid rape allegations. And the popular Democratic state senator Troy Jackson was appointed as the new nominee this past weekend. He's running against longtime Republican Senator Susan Collins, and that race is looking like a toss-up. In Texas, where Democrats have been vying to win an election for many cycles, the Democratic nominee James Tallarico is facing off against the Trump-backed GOP nominee Ken Paxton, though the race there is leaning red. In Michigan, an upcoming primary face-off between the centrist pick Representative Haley Stevens and a Progressive Party outsider Dr. Abdul El Sayed. The list goes on. There's North Carolina, there's Ohio, Iowa. Let's just name a few. According to the Cook Political Report, there are 4 true toss-up races, 2 that are leaning Republican and 3 that are leaning Democrat, and 1 state, North Carolina, that pundits say is likely to flip from red to blue. That is a lot to digest. There's 10 races out there, at least for now, in play. And let's dive into them. So to kick things off today, we're going to get a temperature check on the state of these Senate midterm races. And my guest is Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. And she's been covering the Senate midterms. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off with one of the last states where the primaries are still going on, in Michigan. This has been one of the more high-profile races this midterm season because it feels kind of emblematic, I would say, of the identity crisis within the Democratic Party right now. It's a race between a progressive outsider with a strong grassroots base versus an establishment-backed Democrat. Can you just give me a landscape of that race, please?
I think you're exactly right. This really does feel like the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party and which way direction the party is going to take. With Democrats being out of power, there's a massive fight around, should they hew more to the centrist lane to try to win over independents and disaffected Republicans, or do they need more progressive candidates to energize their base and take the party in a different direction in the way that Donald Trump took the Republican Party in a different, more populist direction? So this fight is really emblematic of that. I think that, again, Haley Stevens is the safer pick because that's how Democrats have run races before. That in a state like Michigan, which went for Donald Trump twice in 2016 and in 2024, again, sort of the conventional wisdom is that and we've seen polling even this week, that she runs stronger against the Republican opponent, the Republican nominee, Mike Rogers, who very narrowly lost the race in 2024. But Abdul El Sayed has a lot lot of progressive energy behind him, younger voters. To me, this comes down to black voters. Stevens is really appealing to those black voters in and around the Detroit area and suburbs. Those are more reliable primary voters, so I think that's one reason she's very much in the fight. This also has become a referendum on money for Israel. She's being supported heavily by AIPAC,
Mm.
and Abdul Al-Sayed has hit her for that in their debate this week, which was the final of the primary ahead of next Tuesday. She's casting herself as sort of, I'm fighting for Michigan. Now, Stevens is sort of awkward on the trail. She's not the most natural campaigner in the way that Abdul Al-Sayed is, but she's hitting Abdul Al-Sayed for sort of, trying to become a national figure within the party. And, she in the debate that they had on Monday night repeatedly hit him saying, he would just try to be another Democratic celebrity, that she's from Michigan and he wants to be a national figure within the party.
Can we dive into that idea of Haley Stevens being a safer pick? Because Republicans have been pretty candid about how they're hoping for Dr. El Sayed to win, because it'll be easier in the general to run against a candidate that they see as a radical, though he wouldn't call himself a socialist. But what does the polling tell us? You had hinted at some of the data coming through there. Is there any info there?
We've seen some conflicting polling. There was one independent poll out this week that did show that Stevens was in a statistical tie with Rogers, while Abdul Al-Sayed was further back. We've seen some polling from Sayed's campaign and some more friendly organizations to him that show that he actually would be slightly further ahead. Again, but I think it just comes down to who Republicans are not being coy about who they would rather run against. That they would rather run against this more progressive pick. They feel like, you're right, he does not identify as a democratic socialist. But to me, this is, the first in a series of August primaries that I'm watching to see if more progressive candidates can win. And, it really makes it easier. It's not a race for Senate, but in the following week, we have a race in Wisconsin governor where there is a democratic socialist who is leading the field, Francesca Hong. And so Republicans really feel like at a time when Donald Trump's approval ratings are at an all-time low and he is dragging the party down, they feel like that they can sort of scare voters in a way about democratic socialism, sort of led by the advent of Mamdani there in New York City, and say, you may not like us, but you don't want to go too far to the left either.
In June, the United Auto Workers endorsed El Sayed, right? That was a surprise.
It was, because Stevens has really relied on her manufacturing background. She worked in the Obama administration leading the auto rescue turnaround. But you do have the UAW doesn't just include auto workers. It includes some other union workers and different things too that are younger and more progressive. So that is what the Stevens campaign has pointed toward. I do think that El Sayed has the momentum behind him, but I hate to be, this sounds cliche, but it really does come out to turnout next week and who comes out. Again, if there's heavy African American turnout, I think the Stevens has a real shot. But if El Sayed, if it's, sort of more white progressives and younger voters that do turn out, I think that he has the edge in this race. But it could really be a stage setter for a series of primaries in the month of August that really could have major implications on the midterms and just Republicans being able to paint the Democratic Party as outside of the mainstream.
I hear you when you talk about being worried it's cliche, but I think it's justified, because who
Yeah.
knows? I mean, the polls are statistical analysis. You have to wait until the actual data comes through. I'm wondering for you, maybe trend wise, we see polls of El Sayed leading in the primaries. Does all of this strike you as a bellwether for how the party leaders might be losing their grip on their power to anoint new leadership? Or is this really, you got to wait until the things becoming clearer later on?
I think that, we'll see there's also a primary, for instance, in Minnesota, where you have a more centrist Congresswoman, Angie Craig, running against the more progressive Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. And, Minnesota isn't as competitive as Michigan, but certainly party leaders would feel more comfortable with Angie Craig there, in a state that has been a single digit Harris state. But I think that it really will just tell us, I think, whose party is this? I think that part of this has to do with sort of outsider momentum as well, where we're seeing, El Sayed, he ran for governor in 2018 and lost to Gretchen Whitmer. Now, Whitmer just recently came out and backed Stevens. I think that was a
Mm,
major endorsement that she got because there was even polling that showed that a Whitmer endorsement could help sway some people. So I think that that is certainly a chip in her corner that could make the difference in these final few weeks. I think this is going to be a really close race, but if it ends up not being close, I think it really tells us where I think you just see the anger in the Democratic Party right now that there is a lot of anger at I think the party leaders and they don't like being told what to do.
mm.
That they sort of want a different direction and they want more outsider candidates. And El Sayed fit that profile. Graham Plattner before he imploded fit that profile that he was an outsider. So you're seeing I think a momentum for these types of candidates, and but I think that when it comes down to the fight for the Senate majority, though,
Mm.
Democrats are in this fight because they have recruited very candidates that have a history of overperforming in their states, like former Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina, like former Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio, like former Congresswoman Mary Peltola in Alaska. So as much as sort of the Democratic Party is having these internal fights, they are in the fight for the Senate because they have gotten candidates that have a reputable history of overperforming their party.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. What Senate races have you been paying attention to? Which states do you think we have a shot at winning over? And what do you think about Democratic strategy more broadly this midterm season? Should the party be leaning into the progressive momentum we've seen in some key races or moving to the center to flip right-leaning states? Give us a call at 212-433-9692. That's 212-433 WNYC. We've got some texts that I'd like to touch on. One is progressives will not vote Republican. Republicans may vote for a palatable Democrat. We've also got a text here that says, how is Haley Stevens safer? Her campaign is propped up by $50 million in AIPAC spending. The AIPAC spending will evaporate for Stevens in the general and be funneled towards Mike Rogers. I want to shift right now from that specific state to general Democratic strategy. So Politico reported on a new nationwide strategy that the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee is implementing called Win the Senate. They've got a war chest of about $40 million. And interestingly, they're focusing a lot of the spending on building up the candidates' ground games, doing voter outreach and volunteer organizing, rather than spending it on things like TV ads. What do you make of that pivot?
Well, I think that you still have to have a good ground game. And while $40 million in so many states doesn't go a long way ultimately, you have outside groups like the Senate Majority PAC for Democrats that are going to be spending a lot. Democratic candidates have outraised Republican candidates across the board, and that money can go further. But we also have a new Supreme Court ruling that happened last month that did away with party coordination limits. And so the playing field is a little bit more even this time because the party committees and Republicans right now have more money in their coffers for like the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And then we're still watching to see where Trump's Super PAC MAGA Inc., it'll need to play in House races and does it play in Senate races. So they can now coordinate without limits with those campaigns and candidates get lower ad rates than super PACs do. So that money goes further. So that could be a major ruling as we're looking toward the fall. I think that things like TV advertising still reaches the most people, but we're seeing campaigns have to do different types of advertising with people cutting the cord, and you're seeing more streaming ads and different things. So I think that, certainly it's significant that Democrats are putting money into the ground game in some of these, redder states, because the path to the Senate, they have to win at least two states that Donald Trump won by double digits, and that's not easy to do even in a favorable environment. So in investing in those ground games can play dividends, but we're also going to see a lot of heavy advertising spending from both the campaigns and from the party committees and super PACs.
And would you say the same for Republicans? Like, is this not bipartisan, but is this being seen on both sides, or is it a different strategy there?
I think that Republicans are leaning more into advertising, but I think you will see them put money into ground games as well. It's still very early. Typically these races do not fully engage until after Labor Day. People are still sort of in the summer doldrums on vacations and different things right now. But to me, it just comes down to where the environment is. The biggest indicator that we have of how these races will tip one way or the other when we look at recent history is where President Trump's approval rating is.
Mm.
Right now, it's at about 39, 38%, and that's near a record low. We saw him sort of there was a little bit of a stasis in the earlier this month, and gas prices were dropping when we had a brief ceasefire with Iran. To me, Iran is the biggest X factor here. What is still going on with this unpopular war? Is it driving gas prices up? Gas prices to me are one of the biggest indicators because think about if you're driving around, you're so cognizant of what the price is on one, end of the road to the next. You're searching for, even just a few cents less, and
Hmm.
people are really feeling that pain at the pump. And Donald Trump is not helping his party by any means. When voters say that affordability is the number one concern, he has sort of downplayed issues of the economy. He's focusing more on Iran and more on the Save America Act, with trying to overhaul elections. He did not. He let the bipartisan housing bill become law without his signature, and downplayed it sort of as a nothing burger. Again, these are all things that you do see Republicans, I think that at the congressional and the Senate level are cognizant of, but Trump is not helping his party by any means with this war in Iran, with the rising prices, and with affordability concerns.
Just this week, I think it was maybe even yesterday, we had a guest on who was describing the gas pump price indicators, like the signs outside of every gas station, as basically like free advertising for how the economy's
Yeah.
doing. They're like billboards, was what the guest referred to them as, which I think really hits on the point that you were talking about it's Trump's approval rating, it is the war in Iran, and all of that kind of potentially funnels through with how much you're paying at the pump. Is that a fair kind of summary of what you're saying?
I think that's exactly right. To me, it just burns in your consciousness. And if you're having to fill up, one week to the next, you're very, you feel it that okay, I paid $10 more than I did last week, and the gas prices were under $4. Now the national average is above $4. What does this hit? And it's not just gas prices either. There's specific states that are being hit harder. We have Trump implementing more tariffs that are very unpopular. States with heavy agriculture. Iowa is a really key Senate race that we're watching. It's not just tariffs hitting the agriculture industry there. It's fertilizer prices, it's diesel prices in
Mm.
states like Iowa and Alaska that are even higher than regular gas prices that are really hitting hard. So this has a trickle down effect in many places. So I think the average consumer because if you have a car, you rely on the regular gasoline, but there's other sectors of the economy that are also feeling high diesel prices, high fertilizer prices that are all impacted by the war in Iran and trying to get through things trying to get through the Strait of Hormuz.
Some more texts coming through that I'd like to touch on here. One is, contrary to what your guest said about black voters in Michigan, not all black voters there support Stevens. I personally know black voters in Detroit who plan to vote for El Sayed. Please stop lumping all black voters together. There's diversity of opinion among even black voters, which I think you were touching on, Jessica, when you were saying that you're going to see how it rolls out after the primaries in the actual election. Fair?
Right, but we have seen, and I'm not saying, black voters are certainly not a monolith, but we have seen very consistently in polling and from anecdotes on the ground too that overwhelmingly black voters are backing Stevens more, but that certainly doesn't mean that she's going to win them win all of them. So I certainly wasn't trying to imply that, Al Sayed doesn't have African American support. He does. And I think particularly younger African American voters may be going toward him. So I do think it's more of it could be, I do think older African American voters, you see Haley Stevens going to a lot of these black churches, but El Sayed certainly has support within the African American community as well.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the more higher profile races, I was hoping to talk about a race that's a little bit sleepier. It hasn't been getting as much attention. It's a crucial state. There's North Carolina. Pollsters are saying the Senate seat is likely to flip from red to blue, even though North Carolina hasn't elected a Democrat to the Senate since 2008. But the Democratic candidate, former Governor Roy Cooper, is leading in the polls, which you had mentioned at the top of the segment. And notably, he was elected governor twice, even as Trump carried North Carolina. Why are the tides turning there?
I think that North Carolina is just naturally going to tighten because it's a swing state. So I think that, he's a Democrat is never going to win overwhelmingly there, but we certainly see the trend line that he is very consistently ahead. We have that race rated as lean Democrat. But I do think that it is the likeliest seat for Democrats to pick up. Um, you have Trump's approval rating underwater in North Carolina, in a state that he won narrowly in 2024. But the Republican there, former Republican National Committee chairman Michael Whatley, is just not super well known. He's a new candidate, even though he's been involved in politics. And he is just very unable to separate himself from the president because he's so closely tied to the White House. And when you have Trump's unpopularity there, I think that is the biggest one of the biggest hindrances that is hurting him in that state when you have Trump so much underwater in North Carolina.
Why isn't it getting as much media attention? I mean, I remember in 2008 it being one, and I happened to be living in North Carolina at that time, so maybe that's a compounding factor there, but there was so much media attention on the Senate race at that time. What's different this time?
I mean, I think that, from my vantage point, it is, I think that just given that the polling has consistently showed Cooper up and that he has such a financial edge, but you could see that edge narrow when I mentioned with some of the national money from Republicans coming in. Whatley is super well liked. He has a lot of connections. So again, I expect it to tighten, but I think that just the fact that Cooper has jumped to such a large lead. Republicans sort of have to worry about other states sort of defending Maine and defending, states like Ohio and Alaska. And it's also an open seat, so the incumbent isn't running there. So an open seat is an easier pickup opportunity than defending an incumbent.
Let's turn to Maine, since you mentioned that, which may be the Senate race that's gotten the most media attention. Listeners are probably familiar with the name Graham Plattner. He's the rising progressive star, was the rising progressive star, who dropped out of the race earlier this month after being accused of rape. And after a brief scramble, Democrats appointed longtime state legislator Troy Jackson as the new nominee this past weekend. So first, Jessica, can you give us a little context for this race? Why did Plattner become such a national figure in the first place, very quickly?
I think that it has to do with sort of that momentum within the Democratic Party and sort of a fervor for outsiders and people sort of outside the political system. He was an oysterman. He was a veteran. I think that he also was just a very gifted communicator in many ways. And he sort of captured, I think, the progressive enthusiasm in the state in a way that Susan Collins's previous challengers had not, but he came with a lot of baggage. And I think that's the risk that you run with political outsiders that haven't been traditionally vetted as much as candidates that have run election after election. So it wasn't obviously the very serious rape allegations were eventually what did him in, and he ended up withdrawing from the ballot. And Democrats made clear that if he remained on the ballot, that they would not spend in that race. But he had a Nazi-inspired tattoo. He had a history of posting very controversial comments on Reddit, a history of toxic relationships with past girlfriends. So there was baggage that was making this race closer than it should have been. Maine should be Democrats' best pickup opportunity. It is the only state held by a Republican that voted for Kamala Harris. Donald Trump has never won the state of Maine at the presidential level. So again, but Collins has consistently overperformed her party, but she's never faced the headwinds in the same way that she has with where Trump's standing is in the state and where her own standing is underwater. So I think that Democrats really kind of almost just needed a generic Democrat, and they may have gotten that now in Troy Jackson. He has a lot of similar positions when it comes to progressive views as Graham Plattner. He's not as gifted as a communicator, and he sort of doesn't, I think, rile up the crowd in many of the ways. And so I think the jury is still out a little bit on Jackson. He ran for governor. He came in third in that race, but he's been in politics there in the state for a long time, dating back to the 1990s when he helped lead a logging blockade along the Canadian border. He comes from rural Maine, very close to the Canadian border there. And one of the things that Collins's opponents have suffered from before, I think that people when they think of Maine, they think of Portland and very liberal areas, but there are some very conservative
Yeah.
rural areas as well, and that's where Susan Collins has overperformed. So Jackson will be her first opponent from the rural part of the state that's from further north in Maine than she is. So if he can really lean into into his background and being seen as more authentically Maine than some of her previous opponents have, I think that's a benefit that Jackson brings to the race.
Any polling data there on numbers for how Jackson is faring?
He is doing it's a very competitive race. It's within the margin of error, but again, I
Okay.
think that we could see some of that begin to move. I think that people just don't know him yet, really, and so he's raised, I think, $2 million since he became the nominee, but he has a lot right now to catch up to Susan Collins, but you will see a lot of outside money flood into this race.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. What Senate races have you been paying attention to? What states do you think Democrats have a shot at winning over or Republicans will keep? And what do you think about Democratic strategy more broadly this midterm season? Give us a call. Send us a text at 212-433-9692. That's 212-433-WNYC. We need to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about the Senate races that are in play with Jessica Taylor from Cook Political Report. Back in a minute. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Kusha Navidar. I'm filling in for Brian today, and my guest is Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and we're back talking about the Senate races that are still in play. So, Jessica, let's run through a few more of the true toss-up states, starting with Alaska. They've been using a ranked choice voting system since 2022. Who are the major players in that race?
Well, the major players are the incumbent Dan Sullivan, but here's the interesting thing. He is on the ballot as Dan S. Sullivan because there is another candidate on the ballot named Daniel J. Sullivan, who initially tried to run as a Republican. There was a legal fight over whether he could even appear on the ballot. So because Alaska uses not just a ranked choice voting system, but the top four candidates in the August primary, regardless of party, will advance. Just because if that race is so close, you could see people getting confused and perhaps picking the wrong candidate. Now, Senator Sullivan will be listed as the incumbent on the ballot. They've tried to mitigate this confusion as much as they can, but Democrats believe that and Republicans have accused Democrats of making this Dan J. Sullivan a plant to try to take votes away. But you have the leading Democratic candidate is former Congresswoman Mary Peltola. She won a 2022 special election, then won a full term in the general in 2022 over Sarah Palin.
Mm.
Now, Sullivan is a much tougher opponent than Palin was, who was obviously a very controversial figure. And she lost in 2024 when Donald Trump handily won the state, but she heavily overperformed Kamala Harris. Her slogan is Fish Family Freedom. So she is running as a more centrist candidate, which in a state like Alaska that has consistently voted Republican, you have to do that. This race would not have been competitive had Democrats not convinced her to run for the Senate instead of running for governor, which she was also looking at, which she would have been a shoo-in in the race for governor. So again, Democrats are in the advantageous position that they are in. I mean, a year ago, I would not even have said that Democrats were in the fight to get in the Senate majority, but they are because they have convinced candidates like Peltola to run in what are still, tough races, but it is candidate quality that has put Democrats in a position to even be able to get 4 seats. Now, everything still has to go right for Democrats to win these 4 seats.
Mm.
The environment still has to perhaps worsen even a few more points. And again, I think that there is the possibility for that to happen once we see after these races fully engage after Labor Day. And as I was saying before, really key where the Iran war is and where the economy and gas prices are.
Yeah.
But I still put Republicans as having a narrow edge to hold onto the Senate just because, again, everything has to go right for Democrats. But there are certainly paths for Democrats to win those four, and Alaska is a very key race for that.
You mentioned Dan S. Sullivan, the Republican, and then Dan J. Sullivan coming into the race. I don't know if you've ever watched Veep before, Jessica, but sometimes sometimes it's like the truth is stranger than fiction.
It sounds true.
Yeah,
it's true.
I was wondering, I always am super interested in how ranked choice voting is influencing elections around the country. Do you think in Alaska it's having any impact right now?
Well, actually, Democrats feel like the Republicans have tried to repeal the ranked choice voting there, and we saw a movement a couple of years ago for more states to have ranked choice voting. It looked like Nevada might have implemented it, but they voted that down. So Democrats feel like because Republicans have opposed ranked choice voting so much, they don't believe that Republicans will even rank other candidates, perhaps diehard Republicans, so that could help them. So just the fact that it's Republicans that have been opposing that system, you kind of have to work with the system you're given a little bit. So we'll see how Republicans, if they try to educate their voters on ranked choice and different things, but Democrats feel like it's a system that benefits them in a state like Alaska.
We had a text come through about Alaska. It says, I think Peltola has the magic, a magnetic personality from her ads, but how will she do in a debate? And then we have another text that just came through that was a question for you, Jessica. I'm trying to find it. The guest keeps using the expression overperformed his, her, their party. What does that mean? Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's how much better they do than the presidential numbers in their state. So, for instance, Peltola overperformed Harris by about 12 points. So she did 12 points better in the polling or in the final result, not just polling, of course, than what Harris did. So, again, it's that overperformance that running better than the presidential candidates in their state that tells us that these are voters that are getting Republican votes, that they're winning ticket splitters that have voted for a Republican at the presidential level, but have been shown a willingness to vote for a Democrat in other races.
I want to turn to a race a lot of folks in the chat are texting about, which is Ohio. That is very much in play. The former Senator Sherrod Brown wants to take the seat back from incumbent John Husted, who was appointed to the seat. Vice President Vance vacated. So how is Brown repositioning himself after losing in 2024?
Yeah, he faced a lot of money, particularly from the crypto industry, that really, I think, hurt him in that election. One of the things that he's really leaning into in this race is a common theme that I'm seeing in other races, particularly in races for governor, but he's really made this an issue in the race for Senate, is data centers. He's really hit John Husted as being too favorable to data centers when he was lieutenant governor and trying to get them to the state. Husted was appointed, as you mentioned, to this seat to succeed J.D. Vance, so he doesn't have as much of a natural constituency in the same way that Brown had. And I think that with Brown being sort of more of an economic populist, the messaging that he has been talking about for years leans more into these questions of affordability. But it's really interesting to see him hit Husted so hard on data centers. And I think that that is an issue that I see as salient across the country.
I was going to ask about that. It seems like data centers are becoming a talking point, at least, and in honesty, like a very real struggle among folks with power and without power in a lot of communities. And I don't mean power as a pun there. It's like those who have agency and those who don't. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you have people that really view these as driving up their energy rates that are sapping up natural resources like water, that they feel like it's unfair that they're getting tax breaks and different things. And so I think that as there's so many questions about just AI and the effect that it's having on our society, but there's very real infrastructure questions as well that people feel like are impacting their day-to-day lives and their bills that are impacting their affordability questions. I think that I see data centers having more of an impact in some of these races for governor because governors have more of a power to issue a potential moratorium in some states.
Hmm.
So as I mentioned, I know we're not talking about governor's races, but I am watching the Wisconsin governor's race where you have the Democratic Socialist candidate Francesca Hong that is leading there right now. One of the issues that she has really ridden to a substantial lead right now in polling is because she has come out so hard against data centers.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. And but you probably see that limited to gubernatorial races, you're saying, because of the agency that a governor would actually have, or is it spilling more into Senate?
I think it's spilling more across the board,
Okay.
but I think that I am seeing it have more salience in governor's races just because so many of these decisions are being made at the state level. But you
Sure.
have someone like John Husted that was in state government. So you have um, Sherrod Brown that has been able to use that as a cudgel in the race because Husted has been tied to some of these data centers coming into the state.
So the other state that I wanted to get to in our conversation was Texas. We had co-host of Morning Joe on MS Now, Jonathan Lemire, on the show yesterday, and he called Texas the white whale, which many have,
Yeah.
of the Democratic Party. Yeah, and the promise of turning Texas blue has seemed to be just over the horizon for Democrats for a long time now. And to be clear, it's leaning red, but it is not out of the question that the candidate James Tellerico on the Democrat side could pick up the seat. He had a pretty high profile interview on the Colbert show, on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, that was pulled by CBS. All of that in mind, a lot of buzz happening around that. How is Tellerico doing to Texas voters? What do you see as the path there on both sides?
Yeah, I agree with it being the white whale, although I've used sort of a different metaphor. I see it as sort of Lucy in the football. I think that Democrats every couple of years
Sorry.
feel like it's going to be out there. We're going to do it. We're going to do it, and then at the last minute, that football gets pulled back and it goes Republican. And so that's the thing that's what I think could happen with Texas again, is that it's just this is a Trump plus 13 state,
Mm.
and you still have just very dyed in the wool Republicans. Now, to me, this comes down to Hispanic voters too in the state. You had a lot of those Hispanic voters that swung heavily for Trump in 2024, and they've, of course, redrawn their congressional lines based on some of that, and they were going to pick up a couple of seats, but maybe not as many as they had hoped to. But you really see a souring of on Trump among Latino voters in particular. I think that's partially on the economy, that's partially on the ICE raids that you are seeing as well. And so if Tallarico can drive out those voters, then I think that he certainly is in the mix for this. And, this would not be as much of a race had Republicans, we talk about sort of the identity crisis within the Democratic Party, but Republicans have their own fight as well because Trump got behind the Attorney General Ken Paxton there, who has a lot of his own personal baggage, including allegations of bribery and corruption, multiple affairs, so much that his wife left him on biblical grounds, even though he
Mm.
has run as a Christian conservative. So I think that he has baggage and he has a lot of work to do uniting the Republican Party behind him in a way that John Cornyn, I don't think, would have had he won that primary. So Tallarico has the ability, I think, to pick off some of those Republican voters that are turned off by someone like Paxton. But I think that he has said things that Republicans are going to paint him as outside of the mainstream on. He's a Presbyterian seminarian in addition to being a state representative. But he said things like God is non-binary, there are multiple genders. We've seen Republicans certainly wield some of these issues and trans issues before effectively in the state of Texas, like they did in the 2024 Senate race. So once Republicans start putting money behind some of these attacks On Tallarico, I think that some of his vote share could go down, but if that doesn't happen, we could be in a different environment where maybe Lucy doesn't pull the football back and maybe Democrats can win.
I want to ask you about that because I love the Peanuts. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in my head right now, okay, it sounds like Charlie Brown is the Democrats going for the football, but who is Lucy? Is it like the Quinnipiac Research Center and the Pew Research Center with the polls?
Maybe I think that Lucy is maybe just those voters that are going to have to decide, do they stick with the Republican Party if they mostly identify with it, or are they willing to give a Democrat a chance?
Gotcha. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so just to recap before I let you go, because there is so much that we've covered, and I appreciate your dexterity with it so much too. There are basically 10 battleground states in play for the Senate midterms right now. Democrats need to keep 4 of those seats and flip 4 more. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. Which states do you think have the highest chance of flipping? Give me like your top 3, maybe.
I think North Carolina is number one, then Maine, and then the path runs through Ohio and Alaska, but we still have to keep an eye on Iowa and Texas. But that Michigan seat, again, Republicans are going to feel a lot more bullish if El Sayed wins there. And so Democrats have to defend their own seats. They're feeling better about defending John Ossoff in Georgia. New Hampshire is still one they're having to keep an eye on. So, it's not, the path also runs through Democrats still having to play defense in several states as well. They can't take their eye off the ball there either.
I love your metaphor. You're sticking to it, and that's wonderful. We have to leave it there for now. My guest was Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's Editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Jessica, thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Thank you for having me.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.